Hi, welcome back to this Tuesday edition of Focal Point AFR Talk. Got some good news out of Illinois. You know who's fighting the push toward same-sex marriage in Illinois? Black pastors. The black clergy in Illinois are leading the charge against sodomy-based marriage in the land of Lincoln because they know that there is no parallel between homosexuality and race. Race is something you're born with. You can't do anything about it. It's immutable. You've never met a former black person. But homosexuality is not that. Homosexuality is a matter of choice. It's a matter of sexual preference. And they know that that's just, it is not, trying to think of the right word. There's no parallel between the battle for civil rights on the basis of race and the battle for civil rights on the basis of homosexual behavior. One is immutable. The other is a matter of choice. So that's going on in Illinois. Now, we've been talking in the first segment about, well, actually the second segment, but talking about Dennis Prager's column about how conservative parents wind up with left-wing children. And you see that all the time in the books of Kings and Chronicles, don't you? Where you'll have a king, a father, who did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and then he has a son who grows up with that example, with that being modeled for him, with those being the values that are implemented by his own father in public policy, who does what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. So we're talking about that dynamic. Number to call if you want to join our discussion on this topic, 888-589-8840, 888-589-8840. Let's go to Paul. Let's start with Paul in Dallas, Texas. Paul, welcome to Focal Point with Brian Fisher. What's on your mind?
Yes. Thank you first for pointing out the point in Chronicles that no matter what kind of a good parent you are, that apparently, people choose their own path so that you're not always directly responsible for an adult human being going their own way. That's kind of one of the points I wanted to make. But I think Dennis Prager is exactly correct, and the problem is when you go to the leftist universities, the sociology and science, political science and philosophy professors have a very, very simple tactic, and you hear it employed in the healthcare debate and everything else from the progressive Democratic Party, and that is it's a simple thing. You find one thing wrong, or you find one group of people who are suffering, and then you spin a narrative around it that says, see, this is proof while what you have in place is totally wrong, totally unjust, and not working. Forget the fact that in the healthcare debate, even when they were running around saying, look, there's people with no health care, that any human being who made it to an emergency room anywhere in the United States by law was guaranteed health care. Mm-hmm. And by the way, if you were a homeless man who passed out in a coma and you made it in the room, you'd be put in the same CAT scanner as the richest man who ever set foot in the hospital. Let's forget all about those facts. Let's just take something negative, spin a narrative, and say, oh, look, there's poor people over here. Oh, look, there's hungry people over there. Therefore, blah, 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 blah. The whole system is wrong.
Paul, let me interject here. Keep that thought because I want you to get back to that. But you know where you can get the best healthcare in the country?
Yeah.
In a prison in California. They spend $18,000 a year on every inmate for healthcare in the prison system in California. You want the best in healthcare, commit a crime, and you'll get better healthcare than the average American citizen. Anyway, go ahead, Paul. Finish your thought.
My point, there's two simple tactics, I think, for every parent, and that is when you're raising your children, do what I can remember my sixth grade history teacher doing back when I was a little kid, and that is you discuss with them the problems that exist in America, and you talk about those problems in detail so you already raise it up. And you point out obvious things like every time you hear about this group or that group has worse health care or whatever, you point out the obvious like, well, where in the study does when it say all this group of people over here has worse health care outcomes, where in the study did it talk about how much exercise they did or how much food they ate or whatever, and you get them to think critically about the problems, and you get them to focus on, while there always are problems, look at what's happening with the 80 and the 90% so that they're already introduced to that. So when they're given the doomsday narrative, they don't buy it. And the second, even better tactic is when you're talking to your political science professor, you go, okay, yeah, you're right. There's somebody over there that's have a bad health care problem. So tell me, comrade professor, what is your ideal solution? And not a bunch of words. You make them come up with a system. And they've got nothing to come up with. What are they going to cite? The Soviet Union? They're going to cite Europe? And when you make them have to deliver a solution, then you can start tearing their stuff down. So those are the two things.
All
Get
right,
them to
Paul.
talk about problems in your own home, and two, force the other side to say, what's your solution? Because it's easier to throw rocks than it is to try to build something up.
All right, Paul, listen, thank you for that call. And what Paul was suggesting about, you can love the United States of America without having to pretend or believe that we were perfect. I had a conversation yesterday with a caller about the institution of slavery. We all acknowledge that slavery existed in the United States. We all acknowledge that it's an intrinsic evil, that it never should have been allowed to take root here. I've often talked about the fact that the only way that slavery even took root in the United States was because the scriptures were ignored. The scriptures don't justify the kind of slavery that was practiced in the United States. The scriptures condemn it. In fact, you go to Exodus 21, if you did the kind of slavery where you stole somebody and sold them into slavery, you'd get the death penalty for that under the Mosaic Code. So we don't have to pretend that we were perfect, but we also need to remind our children that the United States was one of the few countries in the world that abolished slavery. How did that happen? What's the explanation? You got slavery still all over the world. Slavery has existed since the dawn of time. What is unique about the United States of America that explains why here, unlike every Muslim country in the world, slavery was made illegal? What was it about Britain that made Britain the first civilized nation in the world to abolish slavery? All right, thanks for the call, Paul. Appreciate that. Let's grab one from Ken in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Ken, welcome. What's on your mind?
Well, I just wanted to just share my situation. I had 3 children with my first marriage. My wife passed away, and I was a single dad. And I was extremely liberal in my fathering, to the point of insisting my children call me by my first name. And then I came to Christ about 5 years later, and married a Christian woman that had 1 child. She's my stepchild, and then we had 2 more daughters. So we had a total of 6 daughters. The 3 that were from the original marriage, they were about 10 years old when we got married. So they had already had a pretty secular exposure, and because my wife and I had some adult children of alcoholic emotional issues that played out in the relationship. We were both Christians, but the conflict that came from a blended family created a lot of havoc, and I think alienated those first 3 daughters, actually even the oldest one. And but now the oldest one has gotten married and run into a sour note, and has brought her granddaughter and has come home to Christ and come home to us for a while.
Wow.
My 2 youngest ones, I tell them that was God's redemption. We managed to get it right. I raised them from babies. As soon as they could sit in my lap, we read books and we read the Bible and we prayed, and they learned from the very start to relate to God and to relate to the Word of God, and to have a Christian worldview. One of them went to a charter school that was extremely liberal. The headmaster came out of Massachusetts, and the liberality of the school created so much contrast that she ended up being the only Christian in the bunch, and it kind of forced her to bloom where she was planted.
So it actually, in her case, it actually kind of invigorated her spiritual growth to be kind of in a hostile environment?
Yes, it did.
That's what happened to me. I went to a completely secular university, and every freshman, I think I've mentioned this story before, but every freshman in at the university that I attended had to take a class in Western civilization for 3 quarters. We were in a quarter system there, so for an entire year, You're exposed to this professor, very urbane, very sophisticated, had the jacket with the leather patches on the elbows and all that. And it became clear to me over the course of that first year, his objective, his mission in life was to completely destroy any shred of Christian faith that any of these freshmen had brought into his lecture hall. And that frankly just made me mad. It just teed me off. I said, I'm not going to let this bozo talk me out of what I believe. So it actually stiffened my resolve to cling to the truth.
That with Becca. And then the youngest one, Jordan, she ended up at LSU in speech class, giving the plan of salvation.
Wow.
Just pushing against the status quo and standing strong and finding strength in that. And they're both, like I say, they're both our redemption. We were able to resolve a lot of the emotional issues and to come to quick repentance when we blew it, and modeled that for them, and I think that made a big difference.
All right, Kim, listen, I appreciate the call very, very much for that. Thank you for that, and God bless you and your family. And it's interesting, talking about the way that liberal values have kind of saturated our academic institutions. I remember when my son was a freshman, he went to a secular college, and they had an orientation that the president of the school hosted with all the parents of their freshman students. And he had sent a letter out to every parent talking about kind of preparing them for what life on campus was going to be like for their kids and how they were going to be exposed. We believe here at this college that we ought to expose our kids to a wide range of ideas. Your child is going to be challenged here. They're going to be exposed to the entire spectrum of ideas. Now, clearly what the president was saying is we're going to try to brainwash your kid and any conservative values that he might have, brainwash those values right out of his head. So I remember asking him the question, Mr. President, I appreciate what you're saying about how your intention to expose our children to a wide range of ideas. Does that include exposure to conservative values and points of view? He was thunderstruck, dumbstruck, stunned into silence. Nobody had ever asked him that question before. Back in 2.